Hey guys, welcome back to Coding Stuff, and in this video we're gonna build an app which supports multiple languages. So we'll be using Jetpack Datastore to save user selected language or preferred language. So basic understanding of Kotlin coroutines and flows would be better. Anyways, it will be simple implementation. So let's have a look at the app that we're gonna build in this video. Right, let me open the visor. Okay, as you can see we have default language which is English. So there is one icon, as you can see this one. If I click on it, it will take us to another activity which has an Apple image, and I'll go back and I'll press on this change language and I'll select Hindi language, click on submit. As you can see, language has been changed. And now if I go to another activity, you can see Apple we call it save in Hindi, so also it has been changed. And I'll go back again, I'll make it English, or let's make it Marathi. Cool, so this is working, and I'll click on submit. Cool, so let me just minimize the visor and we'll start with the implementation. Okay, so first thing that we need to do, we'll set up the dependencies. So I'll open the build.gradle app level tool and I'll open the Chrome. So you need to search Datastore dependency Android and then click on the first link and we'll add this. So I'll copy this implementation and I'll paste it over here. Cool. We'll also require a lifecycle dependency. So just search for lifecycle dependency Android, lifecycle Jetpack, and we need this lifecycle runtime. I'll copy this and I'll paste it over here, and we'll also copy this lifecycle version. So I'll copy this again and I'll paste it over here. We'll also enable the view binding. So to enable the view binding, we write build features view binding equals to true. Cool, then I'll click on sync now. Cool, so in the main activity we don't have anything for now, but in the activity main I have added one button. You can see this one, and also I have added one text and one icon. So this text is welcome text. So let's just go to the string resources. Alright, in order to add a multi-language string, what we need to do, just click on the open editor. So in here what you need to do, you need to click on this plus icon and we'll provide the key, so which will be welcome text. We'll give it and default value, so welcome to coding stuff. Cool, then I'll click on OK. Alright, so then we need to select this and we need to click on this add local option over here. So I'll click on it and I'll select HI. I'll search for HI, which is Hindi, this one. Cool, so we need to paste, or we need to write whatever the resource in Hindi language. So I'll just open my Chrome and I'll use Google Translate over here. So we can just copy this text from here, welcome to coding stuff in English. I'll paste it over here and I'll translate it to Hindi. Then I'll copy this, I'll paste it over here, hit enter. So we also want to add another language which is Marathi. So I'll search for MR, it's language code. So whatever the language you want to use, just search for its language code, then add it over here. Cool, so I'll again open the Chrome. This time I'll select Marathi. I'll copy this. As you can see, this doesn't work every time. So what we can do, we can paste this, hit enter. Cool, so now when I close this translate editor, you can see I will have 3 resources, string resources. So I'll go to the values, and as you can see, as I have 3 languages, we have 3 string resources. This one is default, Hindi and Marathi. So this is in English, right? So we can just copy this from Hindi and I'll paste it over here. Cool, so this is how you add the resources in different languages. So if I go here, this will be welcome to coding stuff. Now I need to add this change language as well. So similarly, this time it will be simple. I'll just need to duplicate this line and I'll just paste the key over here. Okay, we don't have T, so change language. You can write change language over here, so change language. Again, I'll copy this and I will paste it over here. Bhasha badla in Marathi. So I'll copy this first in both of the resources, Marathi and Hindi. Cool. Then in Marathi, I'll copy this and I'll paste it. And in Hindi as well. So alright, let me add few more resources. So I'll pause the video and highlight the rest of the resources. So alright, I have added all the resources. Cool. So as you can see, I have also added one English, Hindi and Marathi. As you can see, the languages, but I have used translatable to false. Otherwise, if I remove it will give me an error which will say it is not provided in Marathi and Hindi. So you can also do that. You can just write translatable to false and you don't have to write its other language version. Alright, so the resources thing is done. I'll close this and I'll close this. Now if you go to the activity main, you'll see welcome to CodingSTUFF, change language and this icon as well. Cool. So now first thing that we will do is just go to the themes, no action bar. Right, cool. So now we will create an helper class which will be useful to save and fetch data from Jetpack Datastore. So I'll just name it as settings manager. Cool. And I'll collapse the project view. So at the top we need to define one constant, or we need to define one variable. So private val, this is equals to context dot data store. First we need to import the context and data store. This will be equals to data store. This one coming from androidx.datastore.co, and in here we need to pass the preferences coming from androidx datastore preferences.co, and we need to write by preference data store. Cool, this one. And we need to provide one name to it, so name, and I'll give it a name as settings preferences. Alright, first we need to pass in context to it, so we'll create one constant private val context of type context. So when we initialize this settings manager, we'll pass in context to it. Cool. Then we'll create one companion object for constant. So we have two things to save in Jetpack Datastore. So first will be selected language. We need to initialize it, or we need to write it as a string preference key, and we need to provide a key to it. So I'll use selected language in the small caps, language. Then I'll just duplicate this, and this time it will be selected language code, and this will be selected language code as well. Cool. So now we will create one data class at the bottom, so that data class, and I will name it as app language. This will take two parameters. First will be the language, so val, you can name it as a selected lang. This will be of type string, and another val for selected line code. This will be also of type string, not a stack. String. Cool. So in order to save data in Jetpack Datastore, we need to do it on another thread. We cannot do it on the main thread as it is asynchronous. So we'll write suspend fun. We'll use suspend function to save the language. So suspend fun, save language, or you can write save selected language, and we'll pass and app language over here. Cool. So to save the data into Datastore, we write context dot application context dot Datastore, and we need to make edit to it, so dot edit. Cool. We get mutable preferences here, so I'll just rename it preferences, and in the next line, preferences, we need to provide the key, so selected language, and we need to assign the value from that we get from the app language dot selected language. Cool. I'll duplicate this, and this will be selected language code. And this will be selected language code. Cool. So now in order to get the data, we'll get data in the flows, so we'll create one private val for that. So private val, I'll name it as language flow. This will be of type flow, and make sure you import it from the Kotlin x.coroutines.flow of type app language. Cool. So now in order to fetch data, we need to write context dot application context, similarly dot Datastore dot data. Cool. And we need to map it as well, so dot map. Cool. So again we get preferences here, so preferences, and I misspelled the preferences. Alright, so in here what you need to do, you just need to write app language that we want to return from here, which will be preferences selected language, and we need to return one default value, so I'll write here English. I'll duplicate this, and the code I will return as en as a default value. You can return the empty string, but we want some language to be as a default at the start. Alright, so that will be English. Cool. So as we make it private, we also need to make one getter for it, so I'll write val current lang, and this will be app of type app language. We'll use get function over here, get equals to, we'll use run blocking over here, and language flow dot first. Cool. So this is how we'll get current language. So why we use run blocking here, I will explain you later when we use this piece of code in the activity main activity. So we also want to observe the language changes, so I'll write observe language changes. This will be of type flow app language, and we'll return language flow that we have created over here. Cool. So setting manager class is done. Now another thing that we need to do, we need to create one class which will be language helper, which we will use to change the language from the context. So language helper. Cool. So in this class we'll create one companion object in which we'll create one function which will be fun change language, and we'll pass the context over here, so context, and also the language code of type string. Cool. And this will return as a context wrapper, so context wrapper. Cool. So first thing that we'll do is we will assign this context to another context, so we'll create one context1. This will be equals to context, and we'll make it var as we would be changing it. Cool. Then we need to use we need to create resources, so resources, this will be equals to context one dot resources. Then we'll create one val for configurations. We'll get the configurations from the resources, so resources dot configurations, and then we'll get the current language, which will be from the system local. So I'll create one variable which will be system local, and this will be equals to configurations dot local, as it is array. We'll get it from the zeroth index. Cool. Now we'll check if this language code that we get passed is not equals to an empty string, and language code, this should not also equals, and this language code should also not equals to the system local language. So if the language code is not empty string, and if the language code is not the local language that already has been set, then only we want to change the language with the help of local. So we'll create one local val local, and this will be equals to local, and we need to pass the language code over here in the constructor of this local. Cool. Then we'll use local dot set default function, in which we pass the new local, which is this local that we just created with the help of new language code that we get passed in this function. Alright, after that we'll just write configurations dot set local, and we'll pass this local. And the last thing that we need to do, we need to reassign our context1 that we created. So context1 dot create configuration context, and we need to pass the configurations over here. Cool. And after this if statement, we can just return the context wrapper, so return context wrapper, and we need to pass the context1 over there. Cool. So this is how we change the language. I hope it is simple. We just get context in the change language function as a parameter, context and the language code. Then we assign it to another context variable. Then we get resources, and with the help of resources we get configurations, then system locals from these configurations. Again we check if the language code is not empty string and language code is not equals to the current language. Then if this is not the case, if user really wants to change the language, then we created new local, and with the help of that we created another context, and which we return from this function. Alright, so I hope this is done. Now let's just close this class, and what we will do, first thing, we want to show up the dialog or bottom sheet when we click on this change language button. So for that what I'll do, I'll create and one fragment dialog. So new fragment, and we can just write language pop-up dialog frag. Cool. I'll press on finish, then I'll delete these things. I'll also get rid out of this. I'll also delete the companion object. Cool. We'll use constraint layout over here. I'll delete this text view. Cool. Okay, alright, so I have designed this fragment language pop-up dialog, which you can see we have 3 radio buttons inside the radio group. as you can see, language radio group, and then we have one submit button. Cool. So now we will go to this language pop-up dialog fragment, and first of all we'll create one late init var for binding. So private late init var binding, and this will be equals to fragment language pop-up dialog binding, and here we'll initialize it. So fragment language pop-up dialog binding and dot inflate layout inflator, and instead of returning this inflator, just need to return binding dot root. Cool. And here we'll create few variables which will be var selected language, this will be of type string, we'll assign it some value which will be empty string, and var selected language code. Cool. So we will pass these values from the main activity later on. So in the on view created. Alright, so before working on view created, we also need to change this. So we will use bottom sheet dialog fragment over here. Cool. Okay, so now in the layout you can see we have radio buttons, English, Hindi and Marathi. So what we need to do, whenever user clicks on this change language button, this dialogs will be popped up. So we need to show the selected language to the user. So by default, whatever the language that has been passed from the main activity, we'll select it, and also we want to provide click functionality to it. When user select any language and clicks on the submit button, we want to save the language or change the language. Alright, so in the on view created, we'll get this selected language from the main activity. So we can write when statement based on that. So I'll use when selected language and resources dot get string r dot string dot English. So if the English language is selected, then binding dot English radio button is checked, we'll make it true. Cool. So now I'll just copy this 2 times, as we have 3 languages. This time it will be Hindi and this will be Marathi. Cool. And this will be Hindi radio button and this will be Marathi radio button. Cool. So that is the when statement. Alright, now we need to write on change listener to our radio group. So binding dot radio group lang radio group set on check change listener, we pass an object to it, and on checked change listener, I guess this one. Alright, so now we need to implement few methods. So just click on this object and implement members. Cool. So we will change it to item ID. Cool. Then it is asking us to convert to lambda. We can convert to lambda, and I'll delete this stuff. Alright, so here we'll have another when statement which will take item IDs, and we'll compare these IDs with r.id dot English radio button. Just copy this 2 times, 3 times. This will be Hindi and this will be Marathi. So this radio group click listener will return us the item ID which has been clicked. So if the English radio button has been selected, then what we can do, we can just rewrite or reassign the values to selected language. So again, selected lang will be this one. I'll just copy this English. I'll copy this again, I'll paste it over here, paste it over here. This will be Hindi and this will be Marathi. Cool. And we'll also select change the selected language code. So this will be EN and this will be HI and this will be MR. Cool. So now the last thing that we need to do in this dialog is to add on-click listener to this submit button. So down over here you can just write binding dot submit button dot set on-click listener, and we'll create one interface. So interface language dialog click listener. There will be one function, so fun on submit button clicked, and we'll pass app language to it. So app language. Cool. So we'll pass this in the constructor of this language fragment. So private val language dialog listener, or we can just name it as a listener. Cool. So then we'll use this listener over here. So listener dot on submit button clicked, and we'll create one app language over here in which we need to pass the selected language and selected language code. Cool. So this is done. Now we are just remaining with the main activity. Alright, so before starting to work on this main activity, what we can do, we'll create another activity. So I'll select empty activity over here, this one, and I'll name it as a item activity. And I'll design its layout. It will be pretty simple. Cool. So it's just an image view and one text which is coming from the string resources. We have defined two variants of it in Hindi and Marathi as well. So I'll close this. We don't have to do anything in the item activity code. Alright, so we just close this dialog and close this dialog. So now in the main activity, what we need to do, first of all, we'll create one lateinit var for binding. So binding, and this will be of type activity main binding, and let's just initialize it. So binding equals to activity main binding dot inflate layout inflator, and set content view. We'll pass binding dot root over here. Cool. And we'll also create one lateinit var for our dialog. So dialog frag, we'll initialize it. So dialog frag equals to language output dialog frag. We'll pass this to it. Press alt enter to implement the function which is on submit button clicked. Cool. Alright, and we'll also require one instance for our settings manager. So settings manager, and we'll initialize it as well. So settings manager equals to settings manager. We need to pass the context, so I'll pass this to it, or this is not the right place to initialize it. So now we need to override one function or one method which is attach BaseContext, and this function gets called even before the on create. So whatever we want to do with the language, we'll do it in the attach BaseContext. Alright, so over here, as you can see, this context is nullable. So what I will do, I'll write a new base dot let. If it is not null, I'll just rename it to context. Cool. So over here, first of all, we'll initialize the settings manager. So settings manager equals to settings manager, and we will pass the context to it. So this context, cool. Then we will receive the app language from settings manager. So settings manager dot app or current language, this will give us the app language. Cool. And then we'll create two variables. So private var val selected lang, this will be empty string. I'll duplicate this, and this will be selected lang code. We'll initialize this two over here. So selected lang, this will be equals to app language. Selected lang, I'll duplicate this, and this should be selected lang code, and this should be selected lang code. So we have one class which is language helper, which we have created, and it has one function which is change language. So in here we need to pass the context. So I'll pass this context, and I'll pass the selected language code as well. Cool. So this is how we will change the language of our app. So what we are doing here, we are getting the current language from the settings manager, and important thing to be remember here, I used a run blocking here which will block the UI thread. So there are two options here that you can use. Either you can use shared preferences, which is synchronous, you can do it on the main thread, but again it has a risk to block your UI thread. And by using Datastore, you also use run blocking in order to get the current language, and also it has risk to block your UI thread. So both have the risk, but in most of the cases it will not block UI thread. So what I would suggest is create a separate file for your language preference, and do not add a lot of data into it. Just like we used to selected language and selected language code, you don't have to load this Datastore class with many variables or many data. It should be simple and clean like this, only two variables. So both have a risk of blocking your UI thread. So it's up to you which risk you want to take, go with Datastore or just use shared preferences. Alright, so now in the on create view, what we will do, we'll implement binding dot change language button dot set on click listener, set on click listener, and in here what we'll do, we'll check if this dialog frag is added. If it is not added, then we'll just show it. Before that, we can just assign the values to selected lang, duplicate this will be selected lang code, this will be selected lang code, and then we can just show it. So dialog fragment and show. So support fragment manager, and then we need to pass the tag. So we can just create one tag over here. So companion object log t. Okay, sorry. Okay, mistakenly added in the settings manager. We don't need to add it over there, but inside the language pop-up dialog fragment over here, we can create one companion object and just write log t, remove the private. Cool. Then we can just write language pop-up dialog frag dot tag. Cool. And also on click listener to this binding dot next IV button, which will start another activity. So set on click listener and start activity with this intent, this comma item activity class dot java. Cool. And we'll also call one function which will be observe language changes, and we'll create that function over here. So private fun observe language changes, in which we'll observe the values of language if it has been changed or not. But before implementing this function, we need to implement this on submit button clicked function. So what we can do here, we can have first one check if the dialog fragment is added, we will dismiss it. So dialog fragment dismiss. Cool. When submit button has been clicked from the dialog fragment, we'll check, we'll dismiss the dialog fragment if it is added. And here we'll have one check if the selected language code is not equals to the app language dot selected language code that we get passed. If this is the case, then only we want to save the data. So for that we'll use lifecycle scope here, lifecycle scope dot launch and session manager settings manager dot save selected language, and we can pass the app language over there. Alright, so on submit button clicked is done. Now the one thing that is last thing, here we will observe the changes. So in lifecycle scope dot launch settings manager dot observe language changes dot collect, and here we'll have another check which will check for selected language code. This should be not equals to the language code that we get from here. So why we are observing the language change? Because when the language is changed, we want to restart the activity. So for restarting the activity, we'll create one function over here, and I'll explain you this function in a moment. So private fun restart activity. Okay, and this will start an activity. So start activity intent, we'll pass this, and main activity itself class dot java, and we'll write override pending transitions. We'll pass 0,0 for smooth transition, and then we'll finish the existing intent, and again we'll write overriding pending transaction 0,0. So this will restart our activity smoothly. Then I'll call this function over here. Cool. So whenever the language has been changed, we will restart the activity. And why I have added this if condition, because we are observing the flow. So whenever this activity is started, we will get an initial value from it. So we don't want to restart the activity initially. We want to restart the activity when the language is actually changed. So that's why whatever the value we are getting here from it.selected language code, we are checking it with the value that we already fetched from the data store. Alright, so I hope this will work. Let's try to run the app and we'll see it's working or not. So our app has been installed, and you can see welcome to CodingSTUFF, and click on this icon Apple. Right, so let's try to change the language. So now I'll click on the Hindi, submit. CodingSTUFF में आपका स्वागत है. It is in Hindi, and this button text also has been changed and save, as you can see. Cool. So now if I just change it to English, cool. So this is working. Let's change it to Marathi. Cool. So let me just remove it from the recent app, and we had selected Marathi language or Hindi language, I guess. So let's just relaunch the app. So yeah, CodingSTUFF, it is in Marathi. Cool, this is working, and yeah, I'll provide source code in the description box. So if you have some errors, you can check with that. So do subscribe, and thank you for watching.